we were still trying to figure out some of our projects for the year, and I'm starting on a new book, and so there's just a lot going on. But
Oh, that's exciting.
nice to be home for a while.
Did you just get back from assignment somewhere?
So I've been helping with the Gaza coverage a little. So I was in the region in November, and that's the last time I've been out of country. So that was an interesting time to be in the Middle East. But if anything, it's gotten worse since then. So it's just crazy time.
Yeah, you were there in November as all this was going down.
Yeah, so it was. I was mostly on the Jordanian side, so I didn't go into Israel itself. We were kind of teaming it up. I had friends who were colleagues who were in Israel. We were sort of covering the Arab point of view and getting around, talking to people on that side, talking to everything from refugees to Arab leaders, and trying to get a sense of what their temperature was.
What's the feeling on the ground over there?
So good. So are we starting? Should we?
Yeah, we can go right now.
Okay. So no introduction, just roll, right?
Yeah, I like to do the rolling start just to kind of keep a natural flow.
So the feeling is it's a bit mixed. I think there's some relief that it hasn't been worse, in the sense that there was some real fear that other things are going to blow up, and we came close several times, particularly on the north with Hezbollah. With has much bigger capabilities, many more rockets. Could put Israelis in bunkers for weeks or months if that really took off. And even in the West Bank, there's been a lot of activity, a lot of arrests, a lot of people killed, but it hasn't been the meltdown that people were afraid was going to happen. And so there's been this sense of kind of in the region horror looking at what's going on and just how terrible it's been, and what the humanitarian crisis has been like. Some relief that it hasn't gotten worse. And also some, to be honest, there's this unusual, in my experience, optimism, in the sense that people are actually looking forward to something happening that could be good, that could come out of all this. And if there's some way to resolve the bigger conflicts because of this crisis, then that could be a good thing all around. And I was surprised the degree to which I heard that some of the Arab neighbors are still ready to do that. They're dealing with a lot of unhappiness at home. A lot of people in these countries are really upset about what's happening in Gaza, but they're steadfastly looking ahead and trying to figure out what happens next. And if there's some way to go to a two-state solution, or have something that feels like more of a progress in a place where there has been very little progress for decades, maybe it'll be a good thing. And that takes some squinting and looking in the future and being a little bit of a cockeyed optimist, I guess. But there's a little bit of that there, and I was kind of surprised to see it.
Does it still feel like that optimism is there now, a few months later?
It is, in the sense that there's determination that this opportunity is not going to pass. And some of the big guys in the region, the big guys being the Saudis and the Emiratis and others with lots of money, they really want to get something done. And it's always been the history of the region that there's an explosive period of violence and chaos, followed by some progress in trying to resolve things. Maybe the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement following the 1973 Yom Kippur War. There's chances for steps forward, and I almost get the sense that they're refusing to be distracted right now, because that their eye is on that prize. And it could be, really good news for the Israelis if that means normalization of relationships between the Saudi government and Israel, which has never happened. It could be good news for Gazans and Palestinians if there's a way that Arabs can help broker some kind of peace, some kind of stable government where people can have normal lives and aspire to a future. Because that hasn't been normal in Gaza for decades. People have been living in what's essentially a cage. And that's not a tenable situation in the long term. If that can be solved in some way that makes people at least feel like progress is being made and there's some hope for the future, then that's worth doing. And I see these Arab leaders still focused on that and still thinking that maybe we can do this. And there's lots of details to be worked out, and it looks difficult on the Israeli side. The current government just doesn't seem to be interested in a two-state solution, for starters. But there is, even in this government, the U.S. government, there's a sense that, maybe we can push and get something good to happen when this is all over, when the shooting stops.
Is there a fear among Arab leadership right now that Israel might take it too far with the bombings as the civilian casualties rise? Or are they hopeful that through this pursuit of Hamas, which is Israel's intended target, that there might actually be progress made on that front and stability will ensue because of that?
Yeah, I think they all believe that Israel's gone too far already. There's some hopeful signs that the Israelis may be pulling back and going to a less kinetic phase, a little bit more focused on high value targets and not the bombing and the destruction that we've seen. I think the thing that worries people still is that there'll be some kind of incident in the north, something on the Lebanese border, where many people are killed on one side or the other, and then we start walking down an escalating pathway toward a new confrontation, and that's everybody's tiptoeing around that. People are also kind of tiptoeing around the situation in the Red Sea with the Houthis, this rebel group that keeps trying to shoot at ships of all kinds passing through the Red Sea. So far, they haven't really done any damage, substantial damage anyway. But there's always a chance. Just one lucky or unlucky shot that kills people, that destroys a ship, and suddenly sets the region on fire again. Everybody's kind of walking on eggshells, hoping that one of these little secondary crises around the region doesn't suddenly erupt into something much bigger and much more dangerous.
Do you anticipate the current dynamic in the Red Sea being that catalyst?
It has that potential, and I've spent some time looking at this, and I've been to Yemen before. I know it's it's a place it's hard for most Americans to even imagine. It's these old medieval cities, people living in extreme poverty, this wild, barren wastelands in the interior. It's just kind of a crazy place to be at. And here you have this really bizarre group, these Houthis. It's kind of cult-like. They're aligned with the Iranians, but they have a slightly different faith, and they don't seem like they're anyone we should take that seriously. And yet they have some pretty significant military capabilities and a lot of ability to make mischief with anti-ship missiles, particularly, which they've got a lot of, and they're pretty good at using them, and other kinds of drones and ground land-to-land missiles that could strike a target and make things much more unstable in the region. It hasn't happened yet. You've seen just in the last few weeks when we're making this taping, multiple strikes against these Houthis, trying to kind of warn them, stand back, stop going down this road. And we have to hope that works. But it's definitely one of several kind of powder kegs that's out there at the moment that just an unlucky break could set things off in a sort of dangerous escalatory way.
Some of the commentary that I've heard around the bombings is that it's almost just a show of force, but nothing more than that. I believe even Biden said, he was quoted on some video by a reporter, that is the bombing working? No, but is it going to continue? Yes. Yeah. And I've heard that kind of matched with the idea that, Saudi Arabia has been bombing Yemen for a long time, and yet the Houthis are still there and still strong enough to cause this level of chaos.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, because you could see, I think a lot of people who don't understand the region that well were surprised that we didn't bomb sooner, because what do these guys mean? They're going to start shooting at just commercial ships and tankers in commercial waterways. We just ought to swat them down and do something about it. But it's funny. One of the countries that have been begging us not to do that are the Saudis, who used to be at war with the Houthis, because they don't want this thing erupting again. And they had essentially put a lid on a conflict that had been going on for a decade. Things had started to settle down. The last thing they want is to have a whole new war kind of breaking out on their back door. And the other point with the Houthis is they, in a weird way, they welcome this. They love kind of beating their chest and telling their people that, oh, we're fighting a superpower and look how tough we are. And you can't really deter them, because, as one analyst said to me not too long ago, you can't bomb them to the Stone Ages. They're already in the Stone Ages. So it's a group that doesn't get deterred very easily in the traditional ways. There aren't many levers to make them change their behavior. So the strategy so far is just hit them, show them that we have the capabilities. We can see where their missile storage sites and launch sites are, and we can come after you if you keep going down this path. But everybody's being very careful, and I think maybe even the Houthis, trying not to make it, trying not to be so destructive or take so many lives that everybody gets really, spun up and does something, moves it on to the next level. It's all a bit controlled. And if you can keep that balance for a while, I guess that's a good thing. But hopefully the Houthis will be dissuaded from being as provocative as they've been, in the last few months.
Do you believe them when they say that their stated goal in all of this is to enact a ceasefire between Israel and Palestine, or do you think that this is just them taking advantage of the chaos?
I think there's a lot of the latter. I mean, it is true that, so the Houthis have this saying, and I'm going to get it wrong, but they have like this traditional chant, and it's death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, and one or two others that they're essentially, their diatribe. And so they, it's been part of their mantra that they favor the liberation of Palestine, the destruction of the state of Israel. So this is an opportunity to do something in that vein. But I do think right now they're just flexing their muscles and trying to look big and bad and tough to their own people and to their neighbors.
And it's working in some ways.
Yeah, and then the Iranians are happy about it too, because Iran kind of is the puppet master in the region. They supply all these groups, and they have proxies, these militias that are allied to them, and not just in Yemen, but in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon. So Israel's essentially surrounded by these resistance militias of all kinds. There's a really interesting mix of groups, and it has an opportunity now to essentially put its finger in the eyes of the Western powers, particularly the United States, but from a distance, having somebody else do the damage. Those missiles didn't come to us. We didn't tell them to do it. It's all kind of on them. While all along, the Iranians have trained and equipped and armed and funded these troops for decades now. So they're very much in the driver's seat when it comes to these militias.
That's the big argument with Hamas too, right? Is that Iran's been funding them, been training them, and kind of pulling the strings behind the scene.
Yeah. And Hamas is a bit of a strange creature because it's not like many of the other groups. It's not a Shiite group. So it's Sunni, and that Sunnis and the Shiites typically don't get along that well. There was a period just in the last decade when the Iranians and Hamas are really on the outs. They didn't really speak to each other because of the civil war in Syria. They were on opposite sides of that conflict. So they're not best buddies. And I think in the case of Hamas, there is some independence there, and they do things without waiting for instructions from the Iranians. There's a consensus that they didn't tell the Iranians about October 7th. They didn't let anyone know that they were going to go after the Israelis in such a big way. And the Iranians are a bit surprised by that. So they're not always in lockstep, but it's absolutely the case that Hamas today is one of these proxy groups. They take a lot of money from the Iranians. The Iranians are encouraging them and want to see them survive as the leaders of the Palestinians in Gaza. It's a really complicated situation, but they're definitely in bed together.
One of the things that this Houthi combat has kind of revealed to me is the fiscal aspect of all of this, where you have these drones that they're launching, they're like $2,000, and we're using hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of missiles to counteract those.
Yeah.
Which is shocking.
There's a real kind of disparity in the expenditure of these things. Because you're right, drones these days are fairly inexpensive weapons, and everybody has them. And I'm talking about, everybody, all these little militia groups that you've never heard of and I'd never heard of, and they have maybe a couple thousand members, but they have drones, and they have weaponized drones, their ability to attack targets, standoff attacks, and they're not expensive. A lot of them you can buy online. Some of the cheaper ones, surveillance drones. Others are require a bit more expenditure, but it's hard to spend more than a few $1,000s on one of these things. On the other side, anti-drone batteries, the surveillance systems behind them, that's serious money. And I had the same situation in Ukraine with the Russians. It's just stopping those missiles from coming in is a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult than lobbing those missiles and drones out to start with, particularly the drones, because they have so many of them.
And that was, like you said, another realization in the Ukraine war is that, tanks are almost obsolete in this way because you could just blow them up with significantly less money involved in that. And
Yeah.
I can't tell you the number of videos I've seen of Russians being chased by Ukrainian drones only to be blown up a few seconds later, which is insane to see this video footage coming out.
Yeah, I think you look at some of the same war porn that I do, and it's mesmerizing because it's, we've had video wars before, I guess, but this is something else. I mean, this is real on the personal level. You're right, like a drone coming down the road after like a armored troop carrier or a bunch of guys running around in a trench, and it's that intimate of level of combat. But the Ukrainians and the Russians both now have massive numbers of these systems, and they're using them to such an effective extent that it's part of the reason that the battlefield is frozen, because neither side can get a real tactical advantage because the drones are up there watching every move. And as soon as you get a mass of troops or vehicles together, then here comes the HIMARS or there's an attack of some kind. It's completely changed the battle. And I could tell you that folks over in our country at the Pentagon are taking furious notes of this, because this is very much the future of conflicts as far as they're concerned, and maybe the future of non-state attacks too. You can imagine groups like Al Qaeda or even some of these groups like Hamas thinking, wow, these drones are pretty effective. Where do we get ours?
And again, with the financial discrepancy, how do you combat a force that can produce these drones at scale for pretty cheap?
Yeah,
and we're producing $250,000 Patriot missiles to counteract those.
yeah,
that doesn't last long.
Yeah, and there's some countries have gotten really good at manufacturing the drones, including China. They've got fleets of these things that are up for sale. So it's really, again, it's not very hard to get them, and it's not a lot of money.
Do you anticipate Hezbollah entering this if the conflict draws out long enough?
I have become, and I'm always have to be careful, because every time I say something, I feel like I step in something and the opposite happens the next day. But we really worried about Hezbollah early on. And then, messages from the leader, this guy Nasrallah, who's the commander of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, consistently making the point that this isn't our war. We're going to be on the side of the Hamas and we'll support them where we can. But most of the attacks have been symbolic, in the sense that they haven't really gone after serious targets. They've gone after watchtowers and border stations, and there've been a handful of deaths, not many. I think on the Hezbollah side there's been more, maybe a few hundred, but it's still in fairly low numbers. And I feel like that if they were looking for a fight, they would have found a way to get into it already. But I do think that Hezbollah feels it's got way too much to lose. The Israelis have a mixed view about this. I mean, I think some of the leaders feel like, well, we're in the middle of this now. Let's just have it out. Let's just settle everything. But I don't think that Hezbollah wants it. I don't think the Iranians want it either, because I think the last thing they want is to see their most important and strongest militia ally, being, degraded or set back militarily, and that would certainly happen in a war. There'd be huge damage on both sides, but there's no question that lots of southern Lebanon would be a ruin if there was another real conflict. So, knock on wood, if I could find some real wood around here. I'm hoping it doesn't happen, and I think we can be confident that it's probably not going to happen unless something just crazy. There's the accidents that we talked about, something that is just so provocative that the two sides just can't stay apart.
Yeah, I've heard some desire from the Israelis to almost do a preemptive strike to try to take out Hezbollah, so that should something like that happen, or should it escalate in some way, they're not as capable as they would be.
Yeah. And there's some very, very hawkish people on the Israeli side, and we've talked to them and met with them, not just during this conflict, but for years. And there's been this argument that, look, Hezbollah is just getting stronger. Every year they get more rockets and missiles. There's something like 150,000 of them now. Some of them are, fairly primitive. Others have guidance systems, but they just keep getting more of them. And there's also this problem. There's supposed to be this buffer zone between Israel and southern Lebanon, and it's Hezbollah flaunts that agreement all the time, and they have people pre-positioned in those areas that makes it unsafe for Israelis living in the north. That if there's a terror attack like October 7, you could see waves of people coming across the border and getting to Israelis pretty easily. So there are people in the Israeli side who would kind of like to see this escalate, frankly. But I think that that's not the consensus view, and people who are security professionals understand that this would be really, really dark times for Israel if there was a full-out exchange. Because even if they preemptively hit some of those rocket launching sites, there are so many of them, and it's not just the possibility of hitting villages in northern Israel, but you could hit some pretty serious targets, maybe even nuclear reactors and things like that, and that could be a complete game changer for Israel in the region. So I'm hoping that cooler heads prevail on that one, because it would not be a cakewalk for Israel, and it might spiral out of control in ways that nobody could anticipate right now.
Yeah, it almost feels like everyone is just watching and waiting. That the bombing is continuing and everyone's kind of just holding their breath, waiting to see what happens, hoping nobody makes an escalatory move that pushes us too far where now it's all out. And I think people were a little afraid of that path being implemented when we started bombing. The U.S. started bombing, Yeah. But it doesn't seem like it's pushed anybody to the edge yet.
Yeah. And I could tell you that in the U.S. administration, Pentagon folks who are doing this every day, they're pushing the Israelis to wrap it up. Just get this over with. Get the troops out, or pull back to some perimeter, someplace where it's less provocative and there's less of a chance for something to go wrong. Because that's the fear, that the longer this goes on, and the more other parts of the region gets dragged into it, like every day there's a chance that something could go really badly wrong. So I think the hope is that, the talk was just very recently that by the end of January, the serious fighting would be over. And I think we're going to end up spilling over that by a bit, but there's still this pressure on Israel to just get it done and get out. And whatever you think you have to do, just get it done and get out, because this can't be sustained in the long term. Something bad's going to happen eventually.
Does Israel seem to want to sustain it past that deadline? Because it seems like there's some pushback between, Biden and Netanyahu, that he wants to implement his plan how he sees fit, and the U.S. wants it to be wrapped up, wants there to be a deadline.
Yeah, and Netanyahu has this maximalist position that we're going to destroy Hamas, and that that there will be no Hamas left when we're finished, and that may not be doable. You might be able to degrade them, and they probably already have, or will soon degrade Hamas to the degree that they wouldn't be able to repeat in October 7 for a very long time, if ever. But this sense that you're going to destroy, the movement, that probably is just wishful thinking, because it's an idea as much as a group. The idea persists. There's this tendency in conflicts, when you kill a lot of people and you leave a lot of orphans, those young kids are the radicals who become sort of the leaders of the next phase of the movement. So you're not going to completely eliminate it. And the more killing and the more destruction that takes place, as we've discovered in other parts of the world ourselves, you do create more hatred and more radicalism, and it tends to come back and get you at some point.
That's what I don't really understand looking at this from an outside observer, is it in this indiscriminate bombing, it seems like you're just creating more potential terrorists. That especially as you watch some of these videos of these people getting shot as they are surrendering, how does that not breed more hatred and more determination? I watched a video the other day, and I don't know if this is true, because some of the footage is definitely doctored and all over the place, but it was a group of men, 4 or 5 men, and they were going back. They had been evacuated, were going back to try to get some family members, had a white flag, and were shot right after being interviewed by a reporter. And you see that and you think, oh, that's not good.
Yeah, I saw that too. And that's really, really hurtful from Israel's point of view, because you're right. I mean, it's not just the families and the sort of the children, the sons and daughters that may see that video, but it's a kid sitting in a coffee house, in Europe, maybe of Arab descent, or in Pakistan or someplace else, people are seeing things like that and they're seething about it. And they're angry about Israel, but they're angry about, Western countries that support Israel. These are the kinds of triggers that send people into dangerous directions. Sometimes acting out on their own or joining organizations that are committed to fighting back. And I've been doing this for a long time, and it's you see these cycles, and you see the aftermath of the U.S. invasion in Iraq, and this whole generation of angry young men that it spawned, and many of them joining up with what was then Al Qaeda in Iraq, and then what that became ISIS, and then ISIS gets destroyed. But you've got thousands of these kind of displaced people, children of these fighters living in refugee camps in Syria with no education to speak of, with no hope for the future. And you could just see that cycle starting again. And it's, it makes us feel good to kind of punish the bad guys. But it does have consequences. And I remember, when we first started using drones, the United States did, mostly CIA in the beginning, and then the DoD gets into it as well. But that was kind of what was great about drones as an instrument of war to our side was that you can control the collateral damage. You can be extremely precise in their targeting. And so instead of dropping a 2,000-pound bomb and maybe wiping out a couple of families, if you can pinpoint it so that you're hitting one car, or as I've covered, extraordinary hits where they've targeted a guy on a rooftop, which like they did for Zawahiri in Kabul a few months ago, or a couple of years ago now. It's, if you can do that, they feel like we've accomplished our mission, and we've minimized the collateral damage, minimized sort of the inflammatory effects of the strike. It's not 100%, because you still create that outrage, but there is a real desperation in this country to try to limit the killing as much as possible. And it sounds like propaganda, but I've talked to the guys who've been sitting at the controls, and they talk about the how they have to kind of recite back to their air traffic controller. Are you seeing other people around? Is anybody coming and going? Are you sure these are the only people in the building? And they can look at a target sometimes for days until they're absolutely convinced that it's just the target they're going after and nobody else. And that helps them, at least makes them think that maybe they're containing the damage. But again, it's never 100%.
And even when they're almost positive, we can still have that collateral damage. That was the big thing under Obama, right? Was most of these drone strikes did have civilian impact.
Yeah. And in the one case under Obama, there was a targeted killing. I think it was in Yemen, unless it went to one of the neighboring countries. But it was an American citizen, a guy named Al-Waki, who was a sort of firebrand preacher who was we know was behind a couple of terrorist attacks, including the famous underwear bombing. A guy had some explosive in his underwear and was flying to Detroit on Christmas Day, and he tried to ignite the bomb, and then ends up kind of burning himself instead. So it was kind of a real knucklehead case. But the attempt to kill that U.S. citizen ends up killing several members of his family, including a young kid. It's and the guys that are on the joysticks and see these things happen, and they feel that too. There's a real toll to, knowing that your touch of the button didn't just eliminate a bad guy, but there were innocents involved too, and there's some some psychological stress that comes with that.
And the idea that this is an American abroad, even though he is connected to terrorism and these acts, there's no jury, there's no trial.
Yeah. There's no process. There's all the kind of constitutional rights that Americans are supposed to enjoy. He didn't get any of those. And there was a really interesting discussion and calculation made at the time that this guy was so dangerous that the they were able to get the legal authorities that made them feel like they were allowed to do what they did. But there was typically, you'd expect outrage over the fact that this American citizen got none of the rights that were accorded to U.S. citizens. He was essentially targeted, judge, jury, executioner, took him out thousands of miles away from his home.
And the bombing aspect is even more crazy because if we had countries bombing, even if it was just foreign nationals and they weren't attacking civilians in our country, we would be at war within 30 minutes.
Oh yeah, no
And yet
question.
we go and we bomb these foreign countries and it's just, well, they're a world away. They can't get here.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there's something I've been thinking about lately, and some colleagues too, about how countries are feeling emboldened to go after their enemies in other countries where they don't, outside their homeland. It's it's everything from surveillance to disinformation, targeting campaigns to assassinations, and we don't really have any grounds to complain because we do that stuff as well. And if we feel somebody who we feel is a threat, it almost doesn't matter where they are. I mean, sometimes it's helpful if they're in a place that's considered ungoverned space, like Pakistani border region in the northwest, as opposed to Britain. But it's a line that we've crossed a lot, so it's very hard for us to go to other countries and say, "Oh, you shouldn't do that." Just let us do it.
Yeah, how can we be the arbiters of morality in that case?
Yeah, that's a big dose of hypocrisy there, I think, to say the least.
And Russia's been a primary case that you can point to where they do target their nationals abroad, even in Western countries. And yet, as bad as that is, you almost have to give them credit in some way because they're not dropping bombs. They're just attacking that individual.
Yeah, using highly lethal, nerve gases in one instance in Britain.
Yeah, not great.
Yep, not great. Ends up did end up killing another civilian who just happened to pick up the vial out of a trash dumpster some days later. But they were intending to be, very narrow in their targeting and just go after one guy and his daughter, as it turns out in this case. This is for viewers that don't know this. This was a case of a Russian military defector who years ago was allowed to essentially a prisoner swap. He was allowed to go to England in exchange for some Russian prisoners. And this guy continued to be a thorn in Putin's eyes. Putin really had a personal grudge against this guy. And so two Russian, I think they were GRUs, so the military intelligence wing, end up going to Salisbury, England, with a vial of Novichok, which is a extremely lethal nerve agent that was developed by the Soviets at the end of the Cold War, and essentially tried to assassinate him and his daughter using this chemical. And they got both of them. They managed to get both of them very, very sick. But because Salisbury, England, also happens to be the home to Britain's biggest chemical weapons defense base, they were able to quickly figure out what the chemical was, and then to find an antidote. So they both survived. But that's the kind of thing that Russia has historically done. They did during Soviet times, and continue to do it with shamelessly. And they just deny it. So it wasn't us. It was false flag operation, but it so clearly was them because we have photos of the guys who did it. We have very unique poison that was used that only the Soviets were known to have. So yeah, they can claim not to be involved, but they certainly are.
Luckily, they were there when that happened and not in some foreign countryside.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
This idea that these countries are feeling more emboldened to enact these attacks, is that because of some destabilization that we're experiencing in the world more globally that they feel emboldened to do that? Or is that just a track because people are moving around more now?
Yeah. The countries that seem to be engaging in it are the sort of the autocratic states, the ones that no rule of law exists per se within their country to begin with. But I do feel there's a sense of people being emboldened, and it is partly because that seems to be the way the world works now. And just look at the superpower and what we do. And again, you can argue that what we do in trying to eliminate terrorists in other countries is for the best interest of our own national security, but it certainly sort of challenges norms, traditions, and international law. So, but the fact that we do it, it really makes it hard for countries to say, other countries who want to do it, to say that they shouldn't, because there's a big example of what we've done.
This cyclical nature of violence where you have been on the ground for so long and been covering this, do you feel like the heightened tension we're experiencing now is just part of that, or is this an extreme you haven't seen before? What is your feeling on it?
That's a really good question, and I try to back up a little bit and think about everything seems worse in the moment that you're living, and you're looking at stuff on the news and you're thinking, gosh, things are really horrible right now. They've been bad in the past, and we've gotten through really bad times. And I'm thinking about early 70s when there was this earlier wave of international terrorism, hijackings. There was a period where, I was just reading, there was a hijacking on average every 6 days. In the beginning, it was just mostly peaceful. Somebody would take over a plane and demand ransom or demand the plane be taken to Cuba or something like that. So it wasn't violent. But then it became more and more violent. The planes getting blown up, and Lockerbie, which was the big one. Many our viewers will remember, where a Pan Am jet was brought down by a bomb over Scotland, and so there have been some really horrific times. I feel that at least since the end of the Cold War, we're at a moment now where the peril is quantitatively greater, and it's partly because that old sort of security order, people following the rules in the sense they did after the end of the Cold War, particularly, that's gone. It feels like it's there. We're entering a period where Russia is militarily and strategically allied with Iran and North Korea to a degree they had not been before. I mean, they're real partners now, just not just a client state helping out a small poor country, but they're real partners. They help each other strategically and with weapon systems. And because of that, Iran and North Korea appear much more emboldened to do, take action in their region and sometimes against U.S. interest. So it just feels like there's a lot of stuff coming at us all at once right now, and at a moment when our own sort of political system is in absolute chaos. I mean, that's one thing I've never recalled, as seeing things as polarized as it is right now, where people really don't talk to each other, don't listen to each other, don't listen to the same information, and people talking about civil war and crazy talk like that. It as collectively, it just feels much more unsettling and just stressful. And I just feel that myself and my own family and friends, but just with the security people I talk to, there's a sense of, I wouldn't necessarily say gloominess, but it's just, wow, we're really in some pretty deep crap right now, and we're not sure a good way out of it.
Well, as we're talking right now, it's the 26th, and you have a showdown going on between Texas and the federal government.
Yeah.
I mean, that alone shows you the turmoil not only abroad, but in our own country.
Yeah, and with, I think I just saw on I think the Oklahoma governor, I think it was him, was talking about military clashes between state forces or National Guards and federal troops and police officers. I mean, I don't know. I can't recall ever hearing that kind of rhetoric or that kind of talk before. So that's pretty scary, to be honest.
Do you buy into the idea that's being thrown around? I don't know if it's just in fringe groups online, that these lines that are being drawn between countries are almost symbols to what happened during the First and Second World War, where you had these countries start to align, tensions start to increase, and that was the precursor to what we saw.
Yeah. I hope that we have more sense in that. I do, I'm kind of a World War I buff for personal reasons. I had a great uncle who was killed in the First World War, and right around the time of a centennial, I ended up, spending months sort of tracing his path and, what happened. He was killed 9 days before the end of the war, so it was a tragic ending, and we never knew exactly what happened to him until I ended up kind of piecing together his story through sort of tracking his unit on the last days of the war, and really getting relearning that history of how these alignments developed that were, it seemed sometimes arbitrary or just, alliances of convenience. But then once shit went down in the Balkans and there was Archduke was killed by an assassin, then all those dominoes started to fall. And the next thing you know, we're in this unbelievable world war, and was one of the most destructive thing that ever happened in the history of the planet up to that time. And just a whole generation of French and German and Russian and British, smaller numbers of Americans just wiped out. And I don't see the dominoes stacked up quite the same way now. But you do get a sense that there is a new Cold War that we're witnessing, where the European countries, even the ones that were traditionally neutral, like Finland and Sweden, clearly taking a stand with NATO in the West, and Russia now with its own alignment with China, in and out depending on what it sees as its advantage, and the two sides very much wanting to see the other side, put down, if not not necessarily destroyed, but just reduced as a threat. And so we are in this period again where there are stark realignments and real minefields, real mines that people could step on, and you could see things go bad very quickly. Hopefully not to the degree, I feel like in a weird way, nuclear weapons has made it less likely there's going to be that kind of full-scale conflict again, because people know that it's sort of the cost of a true, total war would just be destructive for entire countries. So God bless us. I hope we don't go that far, but we are definitely in a much more dangerous moment, I think.
For me, it feels like China is almost a wild card in all of this. And you hear the rhetoric around Taiwan, and you have to put yourself in their position and think, man, is there a better time if you really wanted to reclaim Taiwan than during all of this global turmoil?
Yeah, I agree. And you're right that China being the kind of the wild card. On one hand, they need us, and so we're much more valuable to them as a trading partner than Russia could ever be. So it makes sense for them not to completely break with the West, and on the contrary, find ways to get along with us, at least economically. But they do have their own interest, and their leadership now is I don't know. I look at Xi, and he's a very different kind of Chinese leader. He's much more of a throwback to the older days, where he's much more militaristic, much more nationalistic. Surrounds himself with yes men, which creates its own dangers and problems. And yeah, you can see them looking at Taiwan and kind of putting out feelers and wondering how easy this would be for us. And you see the Americans very quietly trying to kind of prepare for that potentiality without, knowing full well that we don't want to get involved in a full-blown war with China, but we do want to discourage them from trying to take Taiwan. But that while we're all concentrating on Ukraine and Gaza, it's a very dangerous situation there. And it's, I know there are guys that I talk to in my world that are literally staying up at night thinking about this problem, and how likely is it that the Chinese may really do something, or the North Koreans, who seem to be just completely off their nut right now and just are, just beyond saber rattling. They're making all kinds of noises about attacking South Korea, and it just much more destabilizing behavior than we've seen even from them, and that's saying a lot because they're pretty wacky plays.
When you're talking to your contacts in the government, do they believe that we would defend Taiwan? Is there a sense that maybe, given the circumstance, we wouldn't if it turned cataclysmic?
Yeah. My sense, and I can't say that I know this with certainty, but my sense is that we would do all we could to help the Taiwanese defend themselves, kind of like we did with Ukraine, to make it so cost prohibitive for the Chinese to try to take that step that they just wouldn't take the chance. And maybe leave the Chinese with some uncertainty about what the Americans would do, just let them puzzle over it, never have complete certainty that we would or wouldn't intervene. I know, though, that the prospect of a full-blown war with the Chinese is just not something that anybody is seriously entertaining in our government. It would be a catastrophe without doubt. And if anything, the Chinese as an adversary, they just keep getting more and more strong. Their nuclear deterrent, we see them, building nuclear missile silos like crazy all across the West. Their military capabilities, particularly Navy, submarines, aircraft carriers, they're already pretty powerful, and they're getting stronger all the time. So it's not a war that we'd like to see happen. And I think any administration would try to do all it could to try to tamp that down, while also trying to contain or constrain the Chinese from doing something crazy like invading Taiwan.
Wasn't there an instance, I believe it was shown by satellite image, of China building mock U.S. warships out in the desert somewhere and planning attacks?
Yeah, very precise, detailed mock-ups. I think it was which aircraft carrier it was. Maybe the Gerald Ford. I'm probably wrong about that, but yeah, very realistic looking dummy aircraft carriers, and using them for target practice. And I think that's partly maybe it's a military exercise, but the choice of targets is clearly meant to rattle us and to make us think that, well, we don't want to push the Chinese too far on Taiwan or anything else. But yeah, that definitely sent a message, as does, so this kind of the buzzing of our aircraft, the menacing of ships in international waters, which is happening in the South China Sea all the time. They're being very aggressive in ways like that. And so we as our military and security establishment in the last decade has been shifting more and more to focus on China and Asia, and I think that focus is still there, because despite all the problems we're having with Russia in the short term, China remains the long term challenge for us. It's the pacing threat, as the defense people say.
Pacing threat, but also our current spread. Is there any talk of that, where we are, our funding towards Ukraine is slowly being dialed back, but now we're involved with Israel? Is there any fear that we're spreading ourselves too thin, that should something arise, we won't be well enough equipped to handle it?
I think that's very much a concern, especially with certain kinds of munitions, that we're not on a war footing these days, so we can't manufacture some of these artillery rounds, for example, or Bradley vehicles and different tanks and tank armaments, tank shells. We're very much overextended in that area right now, because we've given away a lot. We promised a lot more, and our manufacturing capacity is just not there yet. They're trying to bring it up, trying to rely, on other partners, trying to get the Europeans to do more, see what the South Koreans, kind of artillery shells they have that they can donate to the game. But yeah, I think there is a concern that our stockpiles are getting pretty low, and it's going to take a big investment at a time when we don't seem to have money to go around to get us up to the level where we need to be, where we could engage on multiple fronts at the same time, which was always the goal, is to be able to fight a two-front war. I feel that would be way too big of a stretch right now.
And what about the desire of the public? You would have to get them on board, and they almost seem completely burnt out with all of this.
For sure. And it was I saw this during the Syrian conflict, and I've written a book about Syria and about the crisis that erupted over the chemical weapons thing, the crossing of the famous Red Line in 2013. And what the administration quickly discovered, that there was not just a lack of enthusiasm, but absolutely, the public refused to go along in any kind of conflict in the Middle East. They didn't want airstrikes. They didn't want, certainly didn't want troops committed to the region. They just didn't want to have any part of a military campaign in the Middle East. And I think that's still true, and it's not just the Middle East, but anywhere. I think people are exhausted after Iraq and Afghanistan, and just want to kind of bring it home and just reflect on our own problems for a while. And we may not have the luxury to be able to do that, but that's certainly the mood of the public right now.
I'm definitely afraid of a head-on conflict, but I'm almost more so afraid of some inadvertent attack, like cyber warfare crippling the power grid or crippling our infrastructure.
Yeah.
Do you think that's on the table with all of this?
I do worry about that. And you can see that. In fact, that was one of the immediate concerns right after the Ukraine conflict started, and Russia quickly ran into a wall with trying to sort of quickly capture Kyiv, and they thought this was going to be an easy campaign. And they failed at that. And it was partly because of U.S. intelligence and some really good U.S. support to the Ukrainians very quickly that helped them kind of blunt that assault. And I was really worried at the time that that it would be a moment when the Russians would unleash some of that cyber capability that we know they have. They can do a lot of damage, certainly to our commercial sector, maybe to our defense sector as well. That seems to be a bit more hardened, but it is capability that they have. The Iranians have gotten very good at it as well, though, and other countries' adversaries. The North Koreans are, world-class experts at hacking and cybercrime. Getting into bank accounts and essentially, helping themselves to people's deposits. All these countries are becoming more and more capable. So that is a weapon in the arsenals of many of our adversaries. And if things get to a point where they feel to their advantage in using them, I think they will. We can retaliate, certainly, and I know just from my conversations that our own capability is extraordinary in terms of being able to fight back on those fronts. The other thing that worries me, and this is something we talked about earlier, is our vulnerability to drones. In Washington, the U.S. Capitol, where I am, we keep getting assured that there's pretty good defense systems in place, and that our people feel like they've got really good kind of invisible shields over our major sites, and we're fairly safe from a drone attack. I don't necessarily believe that's true, because you can launch a drone from the back of a van and it would fly at low altitudes and zip over a fence and hit something and may not be devastating in its destruction, but just the symbolism of a major U.S. facility being hit by a drone. It's a new kind of terror warfare that people I talk to are fully expecting is going to happen at some point, because it's getting easier and easier to do. The kinds of things you can do from a drone, it just keeps expanding. It's everything from traditional bombs to you put chemicals or biological weapons. There's a lot you can potentially do with drones, and it's so easy that it's almost baffling that nobody's done it yet. So I do worry that that's another major vulnerability for us.
I've been thinking about that a lot because of those videos coming out of Ukraine. What is to stop some terrorist element from, if they have an asset here or a sleeper cell here, just buying some $300 civilian drone that people are flying around for photography or videography and flying it into a building and releasing some chemical agent or a bomb? I mean, you could fly, those things can go for a couple miles now, range-wise.
Yeah.
You could be sitting
for sure.
quite a few miles away, do this, and how long would it take us to find that individual? We definitely wouldn't be able to stop it in time.
Yeah. And with precision control. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be a foreign actor or a traditional terrorist group like an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda. Because we have plenty of extremists over here who have their own agendas and may feel motivated to do that just for their own causes. And that's kind of part of the increased peril we find ourselves in, is the greatest enemy may be internal. We just don't know.
Yeah, that's a scary thought, right? Why are we not seeing more terrorist attacks? I believe maybe it was the second term of Obama. You had all of these attacks occurring throughout Europe, and then it seems like they kind of subsided.
Yeah.
Prior to COVID.
It was striking to us because it did feel like that there was the caliphate itself, the ISIS caliphate, started to collapse from 2017 to roughly 2019 when the last little pockets were destroyed. The loss of physical space really took a lot out of ISIS's capability. There was a concern that they would continue to inspire or maybe even order lone wolf attacks, and we continue to see those. I mean, just even since the Gaza war, there's been a couple of terrorist attacks in Europe that people took inspiration from Hamas and wanted to sort of blow up something or shoot somebody. So that always is a danger. But the sustained attacks we saw in the late 2010s just stopped. And I think there's one of the less pleasant things I do as a part of my job is I spend a lot of time monitoring sort of traffic from these terrorist groups, particularly ISIS, but Al-Qaeda has its own official organs. They have magazines. They've got Telegram sites and things like that. And they keep pleading for people to do more. It's especially since October 7, they keep saying to their followers, whether you like Hamas or not, and a lot of us don't, this is a moment for us, Islamists to kind of be together and take action. And so wherever you are, you should do something. So they're rooting for this, and yet it's I don't know if it's because our security's gotten better or people or what it is exactly, but it hasn't really happened. And of course, we're saying this today on January 26th, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But we've been pretty lucky, I think, is that it's been as controlled and contained as it is. I do think that regardless of how the Gaza crisis winds down, that it will be a source of instability and a motivator for people who want to commit acts of terrorism for the foreseeable future. And we could be seeing consequences of that crisis in our own country or in Western countries, I'd say for years to come, because there are a lot of people who are white hot angry about events in the region and want to do something. And so it's just a matter of how motivated, what opportunities you have, and how destructive you can be.
Do you anticipate there being a pivot in their trade craft? I mean, for the longest time, you had suicide bombers being the element that was best. It was fast. It was easy. They could build these bombs. All they had to do was find a young radical they could talk into doing it. Do you anticipate them in the technological age pivoting to maybe cyber or more biological elements? Would they have the capability to do that?
Yeah. So on that, I do feel that they're sort of what's in fashion right now. You're right. First it was suicide bombers. There was a period when we saw vehicles being used as kind of terror weapons.
That was a big one.
So driving a truck into a crowded sidewalk or at some festival and trying to kill people that way. In this country, there's always the opportunity you can do an incredible amount of damage just with firearms if you have high capacity magazines and a bump stock or something that makes your weapon fully automatic. We just saw with the Las Vegas attack, a few years ago, just 60 people killed, some ridiculous figure. So that's potentially available to someone who wants to do that kind of damage. I think about drones a lot. The folks I talk to who study, who kind of, I guess these are the people who do the theorizing and kind of try to anticipate what's next. They've said that we've been lucky with chemical weapons and biological weapons because they're up to now have been not all that difficult, but just more difficult than the other things you can easily do. It's much easier to build an explosive device than it is to create a weapon of mass destruction that could do more than just kind of scare people and make a nuisance. Some of the chemical weapons we've seen that have been used have been pretty crude. ISIS got into the game actually fairly late before the caliphate collapsed, trying to kind of cobble together mustard gas and like very crude chemical weapons, and they succeeded. But they ultimately discovered that we can do a lot more damage just with a truck bomb. So why bother to do that? The thing is that particularly with biology, the things you can do in a fairly simple lab, like a high school lab or certainly a college lab, genetic manipulation, isolation of biological agents that are extremely virulent and then releasing them somehow. There are many things that people may see as more plausible or more likely as the technology gets easier, and it's probably inevitable that something like that will be attempted at some point, and we just have to hope we're prepared for it in some way.
Before we got on here, I was actually reading one of your articles about, I think it's Fire Lab, that China subsidiary where they're collecting DNA data from a wide number of countries. What do you think their intentions are with that?
Yeah, and just to give viewers a sense of what that was about, the people that we interviewed for the article was struck by China's global effort to collect, DNA information and just create massive catalogs of human DNA. And there are all kinds of potentially legitimate reasons you can do that. You can combine these databases of DNA information with information about diseases or hereditary diseases and try to figure out ways to combat some of the biggest disease threats to the human race. So that's a good thing. But you can also use the same tools to target people because of their genetics. That you can use DNA to identify, that you're from a certain ethnic group, or you have a susceptibility to certain kinds of viruses more than other parts of the population. And so you can potentially create a weapon, a biological weapon that would be fairly selective, and would kind of go after your enemies, but preserve the people that you want to live. That's a little bit on the. It sounds like science fiction. A lot of people think it's probably not likely to happen for a few years, but the Chinese in their literature, and particularly the military strategists over there, talk about this: the potential for a biological weapon that would be selective, that would be based on genetics. The Russians have talked about it too. It's something that's a little bit over the horizon, but if that happens, the consequences are just, it's hard to put your head around. We lost how many million people in COVID, which turned out to be not that virulent after all. And if you have something that kills 10, 15% of people that it infects, you're talking about it just, just magnitudes of difference in terms of the lethality.
And to be able to accurately target, I mean, who needs a nuclear bomb if you can just drop a biological agent that targets a specific person or group of people, and then there's no damage to any of the infrastructure, there's no damage anywhere except to those individuals.
Yeah, the cities and the trains continue to run. You've just killed a lot of your enemies. And so that it's chilling to read some of the Chinese literature on this. And some of it perhaps is speculative. Maybe they're just kind of thinking out loud, but they talk about things like that if you can master this skill, if you can create weapons like this, you could do more damage than a nuclear weapon, and you could do very little destruction. So it's, in that sense, it's an ideal weapon if you can make it.
How do you keep yourself sane doing this kind of work and for so long? I mean, are you just in a constant state of anxiety, or?
There's some of that, but there's also just kind of, I guess, the pace that we find ourselves going at. This is such a busy time with Ukraine and Gaza, and then book writing and all the things I'm involved in, that you don't have a lot of time to really dwell on it. And in my case, and also it's almost a defensive mechanism. You learn to put those things aside and go watch a movie or play tennis or do something that's completely just mindless, and just kind of exert yourself and have some fun. Because otherwise, you can really drive yourself insane if you think about it too much. But I think that's where we all are as a society right now, because we hear so much bad news in our media and on our social platforms, that it's a little bit it's sort of damaging to the psyche, and you do have to find ways to escape and to kind of give yourself the space to have some mental health and not dwell on this too much. It'll make you nuts.
Yeah, it's almost a double-edged sword in terms of the information overload that we're getting, because it's so toxic that there's the desire to unplug, which was healthy, but you also don't want to get complacent, because that's when things go even more sideways. So you have to figure out which line to walk through that. I
had some good friends who work in the security community, and I watched them after 9/11. And these are guys who are FBI or they're intelligence people, and they're kind of the same place of life as me, like living in a suburb with a wife and 2 kids and trying to have kind of normal life. And you could see the anxiety play on them, because sometimes they would, as we found out later, knew things that we had no idea how bad things were, or what they were worried about at the time. And they were worried about chemical and biological attacks, and they were worried about another wave from Al-Qaeda that fortunately never materialized. But they lived and breathed this every day, and were always kind of going to bed with the worry that, did I not see this? Did I miss a clue? Did we disregard a communications intercept that was important? And it took a physical toll on some of these people. And I feel like that in some ways we're back in that situation where we're all kind of seeing a lot, worrying about a lot, and you really do have to find ways to kind of preserve your mental health and just not let it completely wear you down.
Yeah, we are in a crazy time, to say the least. I came across I read Black Flags, which was a great book. You don't need me to tell you that. Pulitzer Prize winning. As someone who was not aware of ISIS, definitely not to that extent. I could hit you with the CNN highlights, but I didn't have any fundamental background in it. And to read that book in this current climate was an experience. I mean, you're seeing a lot of these same dynamics at play. You're having Palestinians be involved, the Jordanians be involved. You're really hearing this story of how these groups in Zarqawi came to prominence. And I just constantly found myself kind of relating that to where we are today and the mistakes made, the lessons learned, maybe the lessons not learned well enough. And here we are in 2024.
What I like about that book is that the fact that, it comes down sometimes to characters and personalities and the people that to drive these movements that become so radical and so dangerous. And the story of Black Flags, we focus on one man, at least for the first half of the book, who ends up being kind of the godfather of ISIS as we know it now, and getting inside the head of a really twisted individual who had his own demons and traumas, in his past that shaped him, but ends up becoming this, a monster. And you can see how that happened, and you can just imagine that same trajectory taking place with some young man whose name we don't know right now, but who's part of Hamas, or he's in ISIS-K in Afghanistan, or he's a Hezbollah member in northern or southern Lebanon, and he just lost his family or something like that. And you do worry about the sort of the next Zarqawi, the next person who's going to bring all those events together and kind of shape them in a way that will become a threat to the larger community and perhaps to the world in the way that ISIS became.
Yeah,
So I do think it has relevance.
Incredibly human theme, and a theme of war, which is where we are currently.
Yeah, the consequences that we don't anticipate and how they always come back to surprise us. Thanks for mentioning the book.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to read. I was glad that I found it and came across you, and we got the chance to do this. I know you got to get out of here. Thank you again for coming on and talking. I really enjoyed this. It kind of freaked me out a little bit. I enjoyed this
too. I must say that you're incredibly well read yourself, and you ask terrific questions. You ask the right questions, and I hope your listeners and viewers appreciate that, because you're hitting all the right themes that we need to be thinking about right now. So thank you for bringing me into the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to plug where people can find you, where they can find your work for the Washington Post, your books?
Sure. So yeah, my day job is at the Washington Post, and so I have an unusual name. It's Joby, Joby Warrick, and so it's I'm the only one in the world as far as I know, and you can find me on Twitter as Joby Warrick. I usually just don't post a lot, but I just post when I have something new. We'll have some book news, I hope, in the coming weeks. I'm working on a new project that probably won't come out till 2025, but very excited about it. So I'll be posting about it as the time comes.
Okay, we'll be on the lookout for that.
All right, my friend.